borders. In English, we have different names already, different words to name it: border, frontier, margin. And of course, all these terms have very different nuances and meanings. And in other languages, you may well find other concepts behind the words which design the equivalent of border or frontier. But always it designs the same phenomenon: drawing a line to separate or to distinguish something, two entities. We can find this in natural sciences, we can find it in the social sciences, in politics, and even in the kindergarten, when you have 3 or 4 year olds who draw territories and explain that this is their playground and no one's else. It seems like a basic human strategy to get order in our mind and order into our environment. Well, I organized this talk along 3 main parts. First, I'm starting with some considerations on the utility and on the basic need for humans to draw borders in order to describe and to define our environment. In a second move, we're going to have a closer look to the social construction and especially to the political construction of borders, and then of course geographical and political borders. And finally, I want to turn to our current situation in the European Union. I want to question that claim that national borders disappear or vanish due to the process of EU integration, and ask the question, what have we seen going on throughout these last weeks of the corona crisis? So, in a first move, I would like to ask, what is the concept of borders? What do we use it for? Whenever you aim to describe a system, knowing about its limits or its borders is essential for technological purposes, in natural sciences, in physics, in chemistry, in biology. Whenever you try to describe a system, knowing about its limits is necessary to have a correct understanding of that system. It allows us to understand the nature or the character of the phenomenon we are trying to describe, and we need the definition of the margins, where this phenomenon ends and what takes place at the end of the phenomenon. If we don't know about the margins, if we can't define them, then we are basically unable to achieve a comprehensive understanding and description of a system. When we define borders, when we draw a line to distinguish between 2 elements, then this always contains a differentiation. We always differentiate something. What is on one side of the border and what is of the other side of the border, of course. But also what is part of a system or what is not part of it. What is outside and what is inside. And you could also easily understand that this allows also to say who belongs and who does not belong to a system. Now, if you already have the slides, otherwise you will see it in a few minutes, you will find a beautiful view of our solar system. You know, the sun, the planets, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, and all that. And it's just to give you an illustration why we do have to define borders or margins in order to understand the character of a system. If you turn to the very outer point in the upper right corner, if you can see the slides already, there's Pluto. Pluto is an interesting case. It was discovered in 1930 and was then considered to be the 9th planet of our solar system. And this went on for some time until 1992, when its status as a planet, Pluto's status as a planet, was questioned following the discovery of several similar objects in size and in mass next to it. So in 2005, there was a similar object, which is called Eris, which was discovered which was even more massive than Pluto, but which did not yet have the status of planet. And this led the scientifics to question our understanding and our definition of the solar system and of its borders. And they had to gather in a huge academic conference, as researchers, academics are doing, in 2006 to define what is a planet and how many planets form the solar system and where the limits and the outer border of our solar system takes place. And as a consequence of this conference in 2006, Pluto was moved outside the planets of our solar system. Now, Pluto, of course, is still there, orbiting the Sun, as it probably always did. But it's no longer part of the planets, which are no longer 9, but 8 planets, due to that convention in 2006, where researchers decided that Pluto is no longer part of the solar system. This is just an example to understand and to see that borders and frontiers are socially constructed. They are basically defined by humans, of course, based on perhaps very concrete elements, but at the end, it is always a question of definition, how you define borders and what you put in the borders. Now, in a second move, in a second turn, I want to have a closer look at the social construction of borders. In social sciences, in political sciences, in sociology especially, we are not so much interested in the qualities of a border. So where the border takes place, where we draw the border, but more in the process of construction or deconstruction. Social construction basically means two things. Social refers to human beings, to people, at least two, probably more of them, defining a border and agreeing on that definition. Researchers to better understand the solar system, politicians to negotiate a peace plan, for example. And construction refers to the process of defining and of attributing meaning to the definition. Then we said borders allow for the delimitation of two units. This is a precondition in order to define the units. If you don't know where one unit ends and the other unit starts, if we don't have an idea on where the border between the two units lies, it is of course very difficult to speak about the nature or the character of these units. But construction means something more than just the process of defining, of definition. It also refers to what is going on in our minds when we speak about borders or frontiers. Borders create mental maps in our minds. These mental maps, as we grew up with them, you perhaps all of you remember when you had the first idea of your home country, the first map came up in your mind, the map of Europe, of the world. You were looking, where's my city, where's my hometown, where's my country, the different colors on the map, all these moments where you are socialized in these kinds of real life and of mental maps. They are leading to images in our minds of here and of there, of in and of out, and of course, what or who is part of something or not. Now, these mental maps have, of course, a very considerable impact in our everyday life, because in your normal life, you're not taking part in these complicated considerations that I'm trying to get over you this afternoon without the help of my PowerPoint slides, just by my prose and my verb. Basically, these mental maps reduce complexity. They give us an orientation and help us to quickly find our way around, say, this is part of us, this is not part of us. I can, for example, travel to that city or I can travel not, because there's the requirement of having travel documents, visa or not. These kinds of quick orientation may take place due to the existence of mental maps in our minds containing these borders, which have been defined, of course, in social processes, much more complicated than what I just said, much more complicated than just the two people who define where the border lies. Yet there are examples, historical examples. History is also part of the social sciences, where two diplomats of colonial powers, of France and Great Britain, for example, sat around the table and draw a line on a map to differentiate, to distinguish their zones of influence, and later on that gave the map of the borders of some countries in Africa or in Asia. But this can then, of course, have very concrete consequences in our everyday life. When these borders define the territorial limits of a nation state, the limits of a legal system, or when they define who is allowed to enter or to not enter a certain territory. For us in the European Union, all this was of more of an academic interest for most of us when we're limiting our traveling to the European Union. And it's only when we try to travel further away that we were sometimes quite astonished how complicated it may be to go somewhere. If you move to China, or even if you want to visit the United States, you have to fill in documents, you have to explain why you are coming, and this is more complicated than what we know in the European Union. Now, if we move on from the social construction to the political construction, to politics and geography, one of the main features of the modern sovereign nation state is, of course, its territory. The nation state has the capacity to govern the territory, which is basically one of the main features of sovereignty. Sovereignty is a principle that developed in the 17th century after the end of the 30 Years' War, the religious wars. And if you are an historian, you may know or remember in these religious wars, one of the main problems was always who can claim authority over a territory. Is it religious authorities, the Pope, or is it authorities from this world, a king or an emperor? Along with the capacity to govern your territory, there is a capacity to defend the territory to outside threats and aggressions. And this was basically the birth of the modern system, of the modern international system with sovereign nation states. One of the main principles was not to interfere in the politics of the other sovereign nation states. On your presentation, you can now see a book title of Tim Marshall, which was a #1 bestseller in the New York Times and in the Sunday Times in 2000. I don't see the presentation now, 14 or 15, I guess. So quite a recent book, very popular. And basically the claim was, in 10 maps, Tim Marshall tells you everything you need to know about global politics, explains all the conflicts, the complicated things that are going on between Russia and the West, in the Far East, in Afghanistan. And of course, you can be very critical with this claim. It's a very popular claim, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, and seems quite straightforward. Because of some physical, geographical features of our world, political problems come up or arise. The things are, of course, much more complicated. It's not automatically that a river like the Rhine is a natural border. We have this term of natural borders. You can take rivers, you can take the mountains, the Alps or the Himalayan are not by necessity natural borders. It may be more complicated to travel across the Rhine or to cross the Alps than just to cross an easy geography, but still it's not automatically that these natural obstacles become a reason to draw a border, to separate two entities, or even to go to war between the two entities. But still, of course, the geographical claims are a very important element when it comes to constructing borders. I just want to make you aware that next to sociology, politics, and history, geography is also a social science. It contains also this element where human beings, researchers, define all sorts of categories of territories and draw borders, draw lines between entities. An interesting point concerning the construction of modern nation states concerns the political use of violence, along with the governance, the reigning over a territory, goes what the political scientists call the state monopoly on violence. In political science and in sociology, that concept means that it is the state alone who has the right to use physical force within the limits of its territory. This is the definition, once again, of sovereignty. Now, that's a very interesting case. I don't know if you read the news, if you've heard on BBC, for example, last week, Germany has accused Russia of interfering into its internal affairs. What does this mean? It basically says that Russia does not respect that state monopoly on violence of Germany. There is a case of a murder that took place in Berlin in last August, about 10 months ago, and Germany, the German federal prosecutor, now has accused the Russian government agencies of the central government of the Russian Federation of ordering the killing of this person that took place in broad daylight last August in Berlin's Kleiner Tiergartenpark. Russia, of course, denies having to do with this murder, with this crime, as absolutely groundless. But I'm quite convinced that if the federal prosecutor of the German Federal Republic puts forward publicly this kind of accusation, that it is in some way founded. There's a Russian national identified as Vadim K, who has been charged with a murder. And now what is interesting in that case for our purpose is that the victim was a 40-year-old Georgian national who was a former Chechen rebel commander, considered by Russia as a terrorist. Now I guess if this person would have been arrested in Russia, we wouldn't have heard about him in the Western news, or not very much. Most of our authorities would have accepted that Russia has the right, the power to do so, to take this person to trial and to judge him, and probably even to sentence him to the death penalty. We accept this because it's the interior affairs of Russia. But what we are not accepting, and where the German diplomats, the German government become very angry, is that Russian officials interfere within Germany and are doing executing their kind of justice within Germany, within Berlin. So this is an example where you see how this principle of the state monopoly on violence works up to nowadays. We accept what is going on within the borders of a nation state to be the inner affairs of that nation state, But when the same state reaches out to do the same things, perhaps in our country, in our territory, we're not accepting it. And this is where this talk about the construction of borders becomes very real life, filled with consequences and very much of relevance to our day-to-day experiences. My example is interesting for a second reason also. Within the development of the modern nation state, there was basically developing a principle that there should be a congruence between nationhood and citizenship. That the people of that state, the nation of that state, are those who have the citizenship. The citizen rights very often depend on you being a national of that respective nation state. The right to enter that territory, to live in that territory, the right to take part in its elections, to take part in the lawmaking process, the access to their legal proceedings. If you are a refugee, granted refugee status in Germany or France, and if you are having trouble with police and criminal affairs, you may well not have access to legal procedures, but you may be thrown out, sent away, because you're not having that citizenship status. In all these cases, entering the territory, taking part in elections, accessing the legal proceedings, the existing of national borders of nation states establish a differentiation between those who hold citizenship and the others who are not having access to that citizenship. And these differentiations still play a very considerable role in our everyday life. It may thus be quite fortunate where you have been born, on which side of the border you have been born, but the consequence of it, that you're a national of that nation state, that you're having citizenship of it or not, may come with a lot of consequences for your further life course. So even if we all believe that we are living in a region and in a period where the role of national borders, of frontiers, is developing, is changing, I want to make you aware that in some circumstances which are not so abstract and not so far away, they still play a very important role for your and my everyday life. We can see this even more clearly in a third point that I want to take up in my talk. This question of the process of European integration and how it impacts or how it interferes with the construction of national borders. So the third point of this talk would draw to the deconstruction with a question mark of the Rhineland border. Once again, you see a book title of Michael Loriot of 2010, I guess. Correct me if I'm wrong, if you have access to the PowerPoints, which is called European Union and the deconstruction of the Rhineland border, Rhineland frontier, I guess. So this book shows how this border between along the Rhineland frontier between France and Germany, mainly France, Germany and Belgium and the Netherlands, has completely changed in its meaning and its construction throughout the last 50 years. Let's start with a quick test of your geographical knowledge. If you turn to the slide 12, you see a map of a strange country, which you may have some difficulty to define what it is. This country does not exist in real, but on the next slide you see that it is what we call in these days the Upper Rhine Valley. And now, of course, if we had the PowerPoint presentation, you may find different slides of how this territory can be turned into a representation on a map. The basic representation sees on the left side yellow colors for France, on the right side green colors for Germany, and on the bottom side a third color, blue colors for Switzerland. 3 countries constituting that territory. If we have on the slide, you see a satellite map. Of course, you're not seeing the national borders that are cutting through this territory. On the right side of the slide, you even see a more disturbing representation of the territory where the European Commission has tried to represent the 4 territories or entities making up the territory who receive funding of the European Union for cross-border cooperation. So these are 4 Euro districts, as they are called, in green, yellow, blue, and the 4th color I don't remember anymore. And what is important is that these entities are, of course, cutting across the national borders, across the Rhine. So you see no longer France on the left, Germany on the right, and Switzerland to the bottom, but you see 4 cross-border European entities from the north to the south, which are making up that territory. Now, this is very interesting if you know a little bit about the history of that border, which is today in the middle of the River Rhine. There were fought at least 3 wars, 4 or 5 actually, but the 3 last ones we remember around that border and across that border through the use of violence, through war. The Upper Rhine Valley becomes German in 1871 when the German Empire, the Prussian Empire, attacks France, and at the end of the war declares this region to be German. French recovers it in 1918 at the end of the First World War. Germany once again invades it in 1940, and it returns back to France in 1945. After 1950, the process of European integration fundamentally changes this unfortunate moment or period in time, and basically one of the perhaps the most important, the single most important justification for this process of European integration was to overcome the conflictual relationship between France and Germany, to construct a European Union built around 4 fundamental freedoms of labor, of goods, of services, and of capital. Now, developing out of these 4 fundamental freedoms that you have right from the beginning of the adventure in the 1950s, the freedom of labor becomes the freedom of movement, and basically what we know nowadays, the freedom to settle down anywhere within the European Union. And with the Schengen Agreement in 1985, we see this suspension of border controls. I say suspension because keep in mind that actually it was very easy to re-establish border controls and even to close some borders, some checkpoints during the Corona crisis, though they are not just given up, the border controls, or abolished, they are still there, but they are not executed, they are just suspended. And if you still follow the PowerPoint, you should probably see now some pics from last March, where the Franco-German border at the heart of the European Union, where all this European integration took place, were closed down, starting with a unilateral decision by the German Federal Minister of Interior, but then also followed by the French side, re-establishing border controls and closing some of the smaller checkpoints because, figure it out, neither France nor Germany, we don't have enough police forces to really control any of the multiple checkpoints between France and Germany. So most of them had to be closed down in order to control some of them. This made us aware and remembered us that there is a border and it exists and it's still having its effects. And I want to take you through a quick journey to close this talk to come to an end now with 3 examples of where you might think, what I was thinking before preparing this talk, that the European Union and the cross-border cooperation between France and Germany, especially in that region, are already allowing much more integration, much more cooperation than is actually the case. The first example concerns the freedom of movement and the question of posted workers. What is a posted worker? Quite technical term to design an employee who is sent by his employer to carry out a service on the other side of the border in another EU member state. In our case, quite easily, you could imagine a plumber sitting in Kiel on the German side, sending his employee to repair my water closet on the French side in Strasbourg, for any reason you can imagine, because it's less expensive or because it's better quality or because I only speak German or whatever. But according to the European treaties, I should be able to appeal to the German plumber and his employee to take out this reparation. Now, that's not so easy as you may imagine. Imagine it takes a long time, a whole week. How many hours should this German plumber work, in my case, in Strasbourg? Quite interesting. If you have a close look, if you think about it, he's not working 39 or 40 hours as his German working contract would foresee, but he has to adapt to the French legislation and work in that week where he's posted in France. This is why he's a posted worker. He has to work 35 hours. So the French legislation on labor applies. And the German employer has to do all the administrative stuff, the paperwork, in order to prove to the French authorities that his employee is working according to the French labor laws. It's different concerning the social insurance scheme. There he continues to pay, even if he's working in France, to the German social security scheme, and he's of course paying the German fees he has to pay and not the French ones. So this of course is a very complicated administrative situation, and many of the small enterprises who might be concerned by this, a plumber with 2 employees, are not ready to take up this complicated construction and send their workers to work in another EU country. This is a limitation by national law to what is actually provided by European law, what is foreseen in the treaties. And it's very interesting to see the interplay between these different national and European legislation. The basic problem of this example, and you will see it in the 2 other examples, is the confrontation of 2 national legislations at the border. At the moment, when you are checking out from one border, from one country, entering the other country, you're going from one legislation to another legislation. And even if you may think that there's a European legislation organizing this whole process, it is in reality much more complicated than we may assume. A second quick example concerns the recognition of professional diploma. This is perhaps closer to all of you who are still studying or started recently working, but basically you may agree that the freedom of movement without the European Union should allow, and it allows, all Europeans to take up a job anywhere within the European Union. The freedom of labor is one of the main tools at the disposal of the European Union to fight unemployment. That basically you're free to go from a region where there's high unemployment rates and look for a job where companies are looking to hire someone. But what about the recognition of your professional diploma? Of course, you're not wanting to start it all over again. At the bottom of the professional career. You want that your degrees, your competences are recognized. If you're a plumber, that you can work as a plumber and not only on a non-qualified basis. Going along with this is remuneration, how many money you're paid, social recognition, possibilities to do a professional career. Yet this question of recognition of professional diploma is much more complicated than we may imagine. It's a little bit better concerning university degrees, but when it comes to really have a professional degree allowing you, qualifying you to work in a certain profession, it becomes complicated. There's a European directive on it, you find on the slides, I don't have it in mind, of 2015, which has been reconsidered, revised in 2013, I guess, 14, and it provides for three basically different systems of recognition. There's an automatic recognition for only 7 professions, which are basically medical professions, nurses, doctors, what else do I remember? Veterinary surgeons, who still have to go and see the administration in the country where they want to exert their jobs, but who can claim to be recognized with their professional qualification. Then there's a general system which is much more complicated. If you're a German teacher with a state exam and you want to be a teacher in France, you will have to pass another French state exam in order to become a teacher within the French public system, and of course vice versa. And the third one, which is the one which I'm particularly interested in, is the automatic recognition on the basis of your professional experience. That sounds quite complicated. Behind it is that for some activities, and it's once again the plumbers, the carpenters, the masons, it should be your professional experience which is recognized or not. That sounds good, but actually it's very complicated. It's even the most complicated thing. It means that if you're a young French carpenter and you want to come to Germany, in France, in the Alsace region, there's youth unemployment of about 25%. On the German side, you know, they have a bad demography with a lot of elder people and few young people. They are desperately looking for carpenters, but they won't hire him as a carpenter because they won't recognize his professional diploma. Our young French carpenter would have to send, of course, translated into German, recognized by German authorities, translations, all the proofs he disposes of his experiences, of his professional qualification to a public body in Germany, who will then consider and decide within 9 months and say, you're allowed to work as a recognized carpenter in Germany, you're not allowed, or you have to further qualify in Germany, which will happen in the most of the cases. And so this, of course, complicates very much, once again, the European provision, which foresees that you can easily join from one side from one country to another country, settle down and exert your job in that country. I have a last example which concerns health cooperation. Once again, we have a European provision which is quite clear. In principle, within the European Union, your national healthcare system will have to reimburse medical treatment that you took in another European Union country on the basis of your national insurance scheme. So if this treatment is more expensive in France and you're injured in Germany, and your health treatment, your healthcare system is in Germany, they may not reimburse the difference, but they will reimburse on the height of the German healthcare system. But you will get your money for a treatment in another country. Quite clear, quite easy. The graphic that you probably see, probably difficult to see in the PDFs that you have, shows on the one side countries where people are coming from, who are on the other side searching treatment and asking for its reimbursement in another European country. The largest part, the upper part, concerns France. Of the 200,000, I think, approximately cases, 130,000 are French. And they are looking for treatment, if I remember correctly, in Spain, in Portugal, in Belgium, in Luxembourg. And these treatments are covered and reimbursed by the French public health system. What we are seeing is that 200,000 cases throughout the European Union is actually not very much if you think about the 500 million Europeans. And also that this data comes from the European Commission once again. They did an enormous work to draw up these numbers, and some of the countries, Germany for example, didn't even provide the numbers. Germans, they don't know how many Germans were looking for treatment in another country and got reimbursed about it, and so we don't send the numbers. French, with their centralized system, can send easily all those French who are looking for treatment abroad. This basically means we don't know nothing about how many Europeans are going to look for a treatment in another European country and are reimbursed. We just have some numbers that some countries send to the European Union, but there's not much European cooperation or integration going on with it. If we have a closer look at what's going on at the Franco-German border, it's even more dissuading, more complicated. There's very little concrete cooperation, health cooperation going on along the Upper Rhine Valley. The projects that we may find are once again funded with European money. You can find the project Trisan easily on internet, but they are just doing comparing, monitoring the evolution, comparing systems, exchanging information between the administration of public health systems, but nobody seems able to build a Franco-German hospital or stuff like this. And during the Corona crisis, you've seen that in the first move, the borders were closed, and it seemed not possible to take over some of the French patients to Germany. Only when there were the personal contacts that are existing between doctors on both sides of the border coming into play, those guys were literally driving with the ambulance to the frontier and taking the first patients from France to Germany, and there were about 100 French people coming for treatment to Germany, where this Corona crisis was much less violent than in France. So at the end, it became possible, but on exceptional terms, and basically this was not foreseen in the cross-border cooperation as we know it nowadays. So what is the conclusion of this talk, which started in complicated terms for technical reasons? Borders, you may retain, are socially constructed. Yet this does not mean that they don't have a real existence in real life. They have an impact on our everyday life. They are very useful to define entities, to make a differentiation between inside and outside, between part of something and not part of something. And this is linked to concrete consequences in the real life, especially when it comes to legal questions, to status questions, to citizenship questions. All these elements still are very much structured by the existence of national borders. And the structural effect of these borders thus continues in time. Earlier decisions have consequences nowadays, even if we have reconstructed or deconstructed the meaning of national borders within the European Union. What once was set up, the legal system with its provisions on the free movement of workers, on the recognition of professional diploma, on healthcare, still has a huge effect on our possibilities, on our opportunities nowadays to use what the European Union should provide, the possibility to work, to travel, to take healthcare in different European countries. It is, if we have a closer look within the European Union, the parallel existence of the European Union law and national laws, and the national laws are colliding along the interior borders, which create most of these conflicts. So these border regions, which are also always presented as the heart of Europe, the laboratory of Europe, they are not automatically more European. They are experiencing the consequences of European integration in a more intense way. And also the difficulties, of course, of this European integration. And this sometimes, in some very concrete cases, leads them to find European solutions for their problems of cooperation, but very often these solutions are not going very far, and the whole thing, as we had to experience during the Corona crisis, still is very fragile and reversible. We can turn history back. Thank you very much at that point, and I'm looking forward to your remarks and your questions. Thank you.